Sometimes life breaks you so completely that you forget what it means to love again. Sometimes it takes 6 tiny heartbeats to remind you that yours is still beating. That's what happened to Elias Boone, a weathered mountain man who'd spent 20 years hiding from the world after losing his wife. The folks in Dry Hollow thought he'd lost his mind when he suddenly claimed 6 stray puppies from the town square. They figured grief had finally gotten the better of him. But 3 months later, something incredible happened that nobody saw coming. Those little pups didn't just change Elias, they saved an entire town. The transformation was so remarkable that people still talk about it to this day. But what really happened up in those mountains that turned a broken man into a hero? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Dry Hollow, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. It was the kind of light that made even the most worn-down places look like they held secrets worth keeping. Sarah Boone had always loved mornings like this, back when she walked these same streets with her hand tucked into her husband's calloused palm, dreaming of the children they'd raise and the life they'd build together in this small corner of the world. That was 20 years ago, before everything changed. Before the cabin in the mountains became a tomb for memories, and before Elias Boone became a ghost haunting his own life. Doc Martinez stepped out of his clinic, coffee mug in hand, and squinted against the morning glare. At 72, he'd seen this town through droughts and floods, births and burials, hope and heartbreak. He remembered when young Elias first brought his bride to Dry Hollow, both of them barely out of their teens, but already talking about filling that little house on Maple Street with laughter and the patter of small feet. He also remembered the day everything went wrong. Sarah had been 8 months along when the complications started. Doc Martinez had done everything he could with the limited resources of a small-town clinic, but sometimes medicine wasn't enough. Sometimes life demanded a price that seemed too cruel to pay. Sarah had fought for 3 days before her body gave up, taking their unborn son with her. Elias had held her hand until the end, whispering promises about the future they'd never have. The funeral had been on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Elias had loaded his truck with supplies and disappeared into the mountains. That was 20 years ago, and in all that time, he'd maybe spoken a dozen words to any living soul in Dry Hollow. Sheriff Kate Morrison pulled her patrol car up to the general store, dust swirling in the wake of her tires. At 45, she was tough as old leather but fair in her dealings with folks. She'd been a deputy when Sarah died, remembered the way Elias used to laugh before grief hollowed him out. These days, she only saw him when he came down for supplies, maybe 4 times a year, always looking like a man who'd forgotten how to be around people. "Morning, Doc," she called out, adjusting her hat against the sun. "You seen our mountain hermit lately?" Doc Martinez sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Been about 3 months since his last supply run. He'll be down soon enough. Always comes when the snows start thinking about melting." They both knew Elias's patterns by now. He'd appear like a spectre, load up on basics: flour, coffee, ammunition, salt, pay in cash without a word, and vanish back into the wilderness. The only sign he was still alive was the occasional column of smoke rising from his chimney, visible from the right spot on clear days. Tommy Fletcher burst out of the bakery, nearly colliding with Sheriff Morrison as he clutched a paper bag of fresh rolls. At 12 years old, he was all knees and elbows and curiosity, the kind of boy who asked too many questions and wasn't satisfied with simple answers. "Sheriff Morrison, did you hear about the dogs?" Tommy's eyes were bright with excitement. "What dogs, son?" "The ones by the old church. Mama said they've been there for days, just a whole litter of them. She thinks somebody dumped them off, and now they're all alone and scared." Doc Martinez frowned. Abandoned animals weren't uncommon in these parts, but it always stirred something protective in the older folks. They'd seen enough suffering to recognize it, even in creatures that couldn't speak their pain. "How many?" Sheriff Morrison asked. "6 of them. They're just little things, probably not even weaned proper. Mama tried to give them some milk, but they're too scared to come close." The 3 of them walked toward the old church at the end of Main Street, where the white paint had long since faded to a weathered gray. Behind the building, huddled against the foundation stones, 6 small shapes trembled in the growing warmth of the day. They were mutts of some indeterminate heritage, maybe part German shepherd, part something wilder, with oversized paws that promised they'd grow into substantial dogs if they lived long enough. "Poor little things," Doc Martinez murmured. "They can't be more than 8 weeks old." Sheriff Morrison knelt down, extending her hand slowly. The puppies pressed closer together, dark eyes watching her with a mixture of hope and terror. One of them, braver than the rest, took a tentative step forward before thinking better of it and scrambling back to his littermates. "What's going to happen to them?" Tommy asked. It was a fair question. Dry Hollow didn't have an animal shelter, and the nearest city was 3 hours of bad road away. Most folks already had their hands full with their own animals, and taking on 6 puppies was more responsibility than anyone was looking to shoulder. "We'll figure something out," Sheriff Morrison said, though she wasn't sure what that something might be. That's when they heard the rumble of an old truck engine echoing. Off the storefronts, all 3 of them turned to see a battered Ford pickup rolling down Main Street, rust eating at its edges like some slow-moving disease. Behind the wheel sat a figure they all recognized but rarely saw. Elias Boone, come down from his mountain. Refuge. He parked in front of the general store, with the engine shuddering to a stop. For a moment, he just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, like it might steady him against whatever storms were raging inside his head. His beard had gone completely gray, and his hair hung past his shoulders in waves that suggested he cut it himself with a dull knife. He wore the same clothes he always wore, denim and flannel, and the weight of too many memories. Around his neck, barely visible beneath his collar, hung a thin chain. Doc Martinez had caught glimpses of it before. Knew it held Sarah's wedding ring, the one Elias couldn't bear to take off, but couldn't stand to wear either. It was like everything else about the man these days, caught between holding on and letting go. Elias climbed out of the truck with the careful movements of someone whose body had absorbed decades of hard living. He was still tall and broad-shouldered, but there was a weariness to him that went deeper than physical fatigue. He moved like a man carrying invisible weights. He nodded once in their direction, the closest thing to a greeting they'd get, and headed toward the store. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the soft whimpering coming from behind the church, or maybe it was the way Tommy was looking at him with undisguised fascination. Whatever it was, instead of disappearing into the store like he always did, Elias found himself walking toward the sound. The puppies saw him coming and pressed even closer together, a small pile of fur and fear and desperate hope. Elias stopped a few feet away, studying them with the same intensity he might reserve for tracking sign in the wilderness. His weathered hands hung loose at his sides, and for the first time in years, something flickered behind his eyes that wasn't pain. "They've been here long?" he asked, his voice rusty from disuse. "Few days," Sheriff Morrison replied, surprised to hear him speak. "Someone dumped them off. They're too young to be on their own." Elias crouched down, making himself smaller and less threatening. One of the puppies, the brave one who'd stepped forward earlier, tilted his head and took another tentative step. Then another. Before anyone could breathe, the little creature was sniffing at Elias's outstretched fingers. "Hey there, little fellow," Elias murmured, his voice gentler than anyone had heard it in 2 decades. The puppy's tail gave a hesitant wag. Then, as if some invisible dam had burst, all 6 puppies suddenly decided this stranger was worth trusting. They tumbled over each other in their eagerness to reach him, tiny paws scrambling for purchase on his jeans, small tongues trying to lick his hands and face. For a moment, something extraordinary happened. Elias Boone, the ghost of Dry Hollow. The hermit of the mountains smiled. It was barely there, just a softening around his eyes and a slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, but it was real. It was the first smile anyone had seen from him since the day they buried his wife. "I'll take them," he said simply. The words hung in the air like smoke, and everyone stared at him as if he'd just announced he was planning to fly to the moon. "All of them?" Tommy asked, his voice climbing with excitement. "All of them." Doc Martinez cleared his throat. "Elias, that's a considerable responsibility. 6 puppies. They'll need constant care, feeding every few hours, medical attention. I know what they need." Elias gathered 2 of the puppies against his chest, where they immediately settled as if they'd found their place in the world. "Been caring for things in those mountains for 20 years. Wildlife mostly. These little ones can't be much different." Sheriff Morrison wanted to object, wanted to point out that caring for injured wildlife was vastly different from raising domestic puppies, but something in Elias's voice stopped her. There was a certainty there, a quiet determination that suggested this decision had already been made by forces larger than any of them. "You sure about this?" she asked instead. Elias looked down at the puppies now climbing all over him like he was their own personal mountain to conquer. The brave one had made it all the way up to his shoulder and was trying to lick his ear. For the first time in 20 years, Elias felt something other than emptiness expanding in his chest. "I'm sure." He stood up with the puppies still clinging to him, walked to his truck, and carefully placed them in the passenger seat. They huddled together, but their fear was already being replaced by curiosity about their new situation. The brave one pressed his nose against the window, leaving a small smudge on the glass. "I'll need supplies," Elias said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Food, bowls, maybe some blankets. The general store should have most of what you need," Doc Martinez offered. "And if you need any medical advice, you know where to find me." Elias nodded once, another small miracle in itself, and disappeared into the store. 20 minutes later, he emerged with armloads of dog food, metal bowls, a bag of old towels Mrs. Henderson had found in the back room, and a bottle of puppy vitamins Doc Martinez had recommended. As he loaded everything into the truck bed, Tommy approached with the kind of bold curiosity that only 12-year-olds possessed. "What are you going to name them?" he asked. Elias paused, considering. In the passenger seat, 6 pairs of dark eyes watched him through the windshield, and he felt the strangest sensation, like something frozen inside him was beginning to thaw. "Haven't thought about it yet," he admitted. "Suppose they'll tell me their names when they're ready." He climbed into the truck and started the engine. As he pulled away from the curb, heading back toward the mountains with his unexpected cargo, the people of Dry Hollow stood watching until the dust settled and the sound of his engine faded into the distance. "Well," Sheriff Morrison said finally, "that's the most words I've heard from Elias Boone in 20 years. Doc Martinez sipped the last of his coffee and shook his head in wonder. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "life has a way of putting exactly what we need right where we can find it, even when we don't know we're looking." Up in the mountains, in a cabin that had been silent for too long, 6 puppies were about to discover what it meant to be home. And one broken man was about to learn that sometimes healing comes on 4 legs and arrives when you least expect it. The drive up the winding mountain road felt different with 6 small passengers. Elias found himself checking the rearview mirror, more often than usual, watching the cluster of puppies who had arranged themselves into a furry pile on the bench seat. The brave one, the first to approach him, had claimed the spot closest to the driver's side, his dark eyes fixed on Elias with unwavering trust. The cabin materialized through the pine trees like something from another time, built with his own hands. During those first months after Sarah's death, it was solid and functional, but sparse. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out over a valley that stayed green even when drought touched the lower elevations. It had been his refuge, his fortress against a world that had taken everything he cared about. Now, carrying 6 puppies up the wooden steps, it felt like something else entirely. Inside, the cabin held the particular silence of a place where only one person lived. The main room contained a table built for 2, but set for 1, a single chair pulled up to the fireplace, and shelves lined with books Sarah had loved, but Elias hadn't touched in 20 years. Everything was clean and orderly, but it was the order of a man who had stopped expecting anything to change. Elias set the puppies down on the worn rug in front of the fireplace, and they immediately began exploring their new territory with the fearless curiosity of the very young. They tumbled over each other, sniffing at chair legs and investigating corners, their small claws clicking on the wooden floor. The brave one discovered Sarah's old rocking chair in the corner and tried to climb up onto the faded cushion. After several failed attempts, he sat down and looked at Elias with what could only be described as a request for assistance. "That was her chair," Elias said softly, lifting the puppy up onto the cushion. "She used to sit there in the evenings, reading or working on her quilts." The words felt strange in his mouth. He hadn't spoken about Sarah to anyone in 2 decades, hadn't even allowed himself to think her name most days. But somehow, talking to this small creature felt safe. Dogs didn't judge. They didn't offer empty condolences or well-meaning advice about moving on. They simply listened. The other puppies had discovered the kitchen, where their exploration had led them to the cabinet under the sink. Something about their persistent sniffing drew Elias's attention, and he knelt down to see what had caught their interest. Behind a collection of cleaning supplies, pushed far back against the wall, was a small cedar box he'd forgotten existed. Sarah's recipe box. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled it free, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, streaming through the window. The box was exactly as she'd left it, filled with index cards covered in her careful handwriting. Sunday. Pot roast, grandmother's apple pie, Elias's favorite cornbread. Each card was a memory, a Sunday dinner, a moment of domestic happiness he'd convinced himself he'd forgotten. At the bottom of the box, beneath all the recipes, was something that stopped his breathing entirely. A small wooden whistle, carved from pine and sanded smooth. Sarah had made it during her 8th month, when her belly was round with their son, and she spent her evenings preparing for their arrival. She'd carved it with the same patience she brought to everything, intending it to be the baby's first toy. Elias sank into the nearest chair, the whistle cradled in his palm like something sacred. 20 years of carefully constructed numbness cracked apart in an instant, and the grief he'd been holding at bay crashed over him like a dam bursting. He doubled over, great shaking sobs tearing from his chest, the sound foreign and raw in the silent cabin. The puppies sensed his distress immediately. They abandoned their exploration and converged on him, whimpering and pressing against his legs, trying to comfort something they couldn't understand but recognized as pain. The brave one somehow managed to scramble up onto his lap, small paws, pressing against his chest as if trying to hold the broken pieces together. For the first time in 20 years, Elias wept. Not the silent, dry-eyed grieving he'd done at Sarah's funeral, but the deep, cleansing tears that should have come decades ago. He cried for his wife, for their unborn son, for the life they'd planned and lost. He cried for 20 years of self-imposed exile, for birthdays and Christmases and ordinary Tuesdays he'd let slip away in his determination to feel nothing. The puppies stayed with him through it all, a warm pile of unconditional acceptance. They didn't try to fix him or make it better. They simply stayed, their presence a reminder that even in the darkest places, life found a way to offer comfort. When the storm finally passed, Elias found himself spent but somehow lighter. The whistle was still in his hand, but now it felt less like a symbol of loss and more like a bridge between then and now. Sarah had made it with love, intending it for their child. Maybe, he thought, she wouldn't mind if it found a different purpose. He looked down at the 6 puppies who had arranged themselves around him like furry guardians. "You need names," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. and food, and proper beds. The brave one wagged his tail as if he understood every word. Another puppy, this one smaller than the rest, with one ear that refused to stand up properly, pressed closer to Elias's leg and made a small, contented sound. Elias spent the rest of the afternoon puppy-proofing the cabin and setting up sleeping areas. He moved breakable items to higher shelves, blocked off access to the back bedrooms, and arranged a collection of old blankets near the fireplace where the puppies could sleep warm and safe. As evening approached, he mixed up their first meal, puppy food softened with warm milk, just as Doc Martinez had recommended. 6 eager faces watched his every movement, and when he set down the bowls, they attacked their dinner with the enthusiasm of creatures who had known real hunger. Watching them eat, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Responsibility for something other than his own survival. These small lives depended on him completely. They would need feeding and care and attention, not just today, but for years to come. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with something that might have been purpose. After dinner, the puppies explored their new home with renewed energy. They investigated every corner, claimed favorite spots, and established the beginnings of a pack hierarchy. The brave one was clearly the leader, but even the smallest one, the one with the floppy ear, had her own personality and preferences. As darkness settled over the mountains, Elias built a fire and settled into his chair with a cup of coffee. The puppies had worn themselves out and were now arranged in a sleepy pile on their blankets, but the brave one had once again claimed a spot close to Elias's feet. For the first time in 20 years, the cabin didn't feel empty. The soft sounds of sleeping puppies, their gentle breathing, the occasional whimper or adjustment, filled the silence that had been his only companion for so long. It wasn't the same as having Sarah there. Would never be the same, but it was something. It was life continuing despite loss, hope persisting in the face of grief. Elias picked up Sarah's whistle and turned it over in his hands. Tomorrow, he would start teaching the puppies to come when called. He would establish routines and boundaries, begin the long process of turning 6 orphaned creatures into a family. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges he couldn't anticipate. But tonight, for the first time since he'd lost everything that mattered, Elias Boone felt like he might have found something worth caring about again. 6 somethings, actually, and every one of them was fast asleep and trusting him to keep them safe. The brave one stirred in his sleep, and Elias reached down to gently stroke his fur. "Scout," he said quietly, trying out the name. "You're Scout, aren't you? Always the first one to check things out." Scout's tail gave a sleepy wag, and Elias smiled. The second smile in 20 years, and somehow it came easier than the first. The first week with 6 puppies taught Elias things about himself he'd forgotten he could learn. Like how his capacity for patience had somehow survived 20 years of solitude, and how his hands remembered gentleness even when his heart had thought it forgotten. Each morning brought new discoveries as the puppies' personalities emerged like wildflowers pushing through snow. Scout remained the leader, always first to investigate new sounds or venture into unexplored corners of the cabin. He had a way of tilting his head when Elias spoke that suggested he understood more than any puppy should. The small one with the floppy ear had claimed the name Gentle, not just for her size, but for the way she approached everything with careful consideration, never rushing, always watching before acting. The others revealed themselves more slowly. There was Brave, who, despite being the second smallest, had no fear of anything. Not the crackling fire, not the wind rattling the windows, not even the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Swift earned her name by being faster than her littermates, despite having the shortest legs, darting between their feet like quicksilver. Strong was the largest, with paws that promised he'd grow into a formidable dog, but his temperament was surprisingly calm and steady. And then there was Wise, who had the unsettling habit of watching Elias with ancient eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. By the end of the first week, Elias had established routines that structured his days in ways they hadn't been structured in decades. Morning feeding at sunrise, followed by supervised outdoor time, while he worked on expanding the cabin's small porch into a proper pen. Afternoon training sessions, where he taught basic commands using Sarah's whistle, and gentle guidance. Evening feeding, then quiet time by the fire, where the puppies would settle into their pile of blankets, and Elias would find himself talking to them about things he'd never expected to share with anyone. The leather-bound journal had been Sarah's idea, purchased for him during their first year of marriage, when she'd noticed how he liked to make note of seasonal changes and animal behavior. He'd used it sporadically then, mostly to record hunting and trapping observations. After her death, it had sat empty on the shelf, too painful to touch, because it reminded him of her belief that his thoughts were worth preserving. Now, 3 weeks into his life with the puppies, he found himself reaching for it each evening. At first, his entries were practical observations. Scout responds well to whistle commands. Gentle prefers softer tones. Brave needs firm boundaries. But gradually, the notes became more personal, more reflective. Day 18. Wise sat with me on the porch this morning while I had coffee. Didn't try to play or explore like the others. Just sat there, looking out at the valley like he was thinking deep thoughts. Reminded me of Sarah when she was deciding something important. She used to get that same expression. Day 22. Had to make a supply run to town today. Left them alone for 3 hours, longest yet. Came home to find they'd gotten into the flour somehow and tracked white paw prints all over the cabin. Should have been angry, but Scout looked so guilty that I laughed instead. Haven't laughed in 20 years, forgot what it felt like. The need for more supplies had been building for days. The puppies were growing rapidly, their appetites increasing along with their size. More importantly, Doc Martinez had been right about medical care. Wise had developed a slight limp that worried Elias, and several of the others needed their first round of vaccinations. The drive down to Dry Hollow felt different this time. Instead of the grim resignation that usually accompanied his supply runs, Elias found himself oddly nervous. Not about leaving the puppies, he'd puppy-proofed the cabin thoroughly, and they'd be fine for a few hours. But about facing the townspeople. Again, about the inevitable questions and curious looks. The main street looked the same as always, but somehow brighter. Maybe it was the spring weather, or maybe it was simply that Elias was seeing it through eyes that had remembered how to notice things beyond mere survival. He parked in front of the general store and took a moment to steel himself. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Henderson behind the counter, probably with a dozen questions ready about his sudden acquisition of 6 puppies. The thought should have sent him retreating back to the mountains, but instead he found himself almost looking forward to the interaction. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Mrs. Henderson looked up with undisguised curiosity. "Elias Boone, how are those puppies getting along?" "Growing fast," he replied, surprising himself by offering more than his usual monosyllabic responses. "Need more food and some medical supplies. Doc Martinez mentioned you might be coming in. He's got some things set aside for you." Mrs. Henderson bustled around the counter with the efficiency of someone who'd been running the same store for 40 years. "How many did you end up taking? 6, wasn't it?" 6. Elias found himself actually smiling slightly. "They've got distinct personalities already. Keeping me busy, I'll bet they are. Dogs have a way of doing that." She loaded his arms with dog food, puppy vitamins, and a collection of items Doc Martinez had recommended. "You know, my grandson Tommy's been asking about them non-stop, thinks you're some kind of hero, taking them all in like that." The comment caught Elias off guard. Hero wasn't a word anyone had applied to him in decades. Hermit maybe, ghost, but not hero. "Just doing what needed doing," he said quietly. "Sometimes that's what heroism looks like," Mrs. Henderson replied. "The simple act of caring when you don't have to." Outside, Elias loaded his supplies into the truck and was preparing to leave when he spotted a familiar figure approaching. Tommy Fletcher was walking down the sidewalk with the purposeful stride of a boy on a mission, and when he saw Elias, his face lit up with genuine excitement. "Mr. Boone, how are the puppies? Are they eating good? Did you name them yet?" The rapid-fire questions made Elias think of Sarah, who'd always claimed that children and puppies had the same inexhaustible energy for life. "They're doing well," he said, "growing fast, and yes, they have names now. What are they?" Tommy bounced slightly on his toes with anticipation. Scout, brave, gentle, swift, strong, and wise. Tommy repeated each name carefully, as if committing them to memory. "Those are good names. They sound like a pack of heroes or something." "Maybe they are," Elias heard himself say. The boy's eyes went wide. "Could I maybe see them sometime? I promise I'd be careful and not upset them or anything." The request should have triggered every defensive instinct Elias had developed over the past 20 years. His cabin was his sanctuary, the one place where he didn't have to pretend to be anything other than what he was. But looking at Tommy's eager face, he found those old barriers beginning to crumble. They could probably use some socialization, he said slowly, "learning to be around different people." "Really, you mean it?" Elias nodded, and Tommy's grin could have powered the entire town. "Maybe next week, when they've had their shots." As he drove back up the mountain, Elias reflected on how much had changed in just 3 weeks. He'd not only had actual conversations with 2 different people, but he'd invited one of them to visit his home. The old Elias would have been horrified, but the man he was becoming, the man 6 puppies were helping him remember how to be, found the prospect oddly appealing. Back at the cabin, 6 eager faces greeted him at the door, tails wagging with the kind of pure joy that only dogs could manage. Scout had somehow gotten his head stuck in an empty food bowl. Brave was proudly displaying a chewed slipper, and Gentle was sitting patiently by the door, as if she'd been waiting there the entire time he was gone. "Miss me, did you?" Elias asked, and the enthusiastic response left no doubt. That evening, as he wrote in his journal by firelight, Elias found himself looking forward to tomorrow in a way he hadn't in decades. There would be training to continue, a pen to finish building, and eventually a young visitor to prepare for. For the first time since Sarah's death, he had plans that extended beyond simple survival. Day 25, he wrote. Invited Tommy Fletcher to visit next week. Not sure what I was thinking, but the boy seemed so eager. The puppies would probably enjoy the company. Sarah always said children and dogs brought out the best in each other. Maybe she was right about that too. The morning Tommy Fletcher was scheduled to visit, Elias found himself doing something he hadn't done in 20 years, cleaning for company. It wasn't that the cabin was dirty. Solitude had made him fastidious about order and cleanliness. But having a guest, especially a young one, felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. The puppies, now 8 weeks old and considerably larger, seemed to sense something different about the day. They were more energetic than usual, racing around the cabin in elaborate games of chase that involved much barking and tumbling. Scout had appointed himself supervisor of Elias's preparations, following him from room to room with the air of a foreman overseeing important work. While straightening the main room, Elias's gaze fell on the storage shed visible through the kitchen window. He'd avoided that building for years, knowing it contained reminders of the life he'd shared with Sarah, but something about the approaching visit, about the gradual awakening happening in his heart, made him reconsider. The shed door creaked on rusty hinges as he pulled it open, dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight that penetrated the gloom. Inside, covered by tarps and 20 years of accumulated silence, were the remnants of domestic dreams, furniture they'd planned to use. When they expanded the cabin, Sarah's sewing machine, still threaded with blue cotton from the baby quilt she'd never finished. And there, in the far corner, a collection of garden tools that had once promised springs full of fresh vegetables and herbs. Elias lifted the tarp covering Sarah's gardening supplies with hands that trembled slightly. The tools were well made, It built to last, a spade with a hickory handle she'd chosen herself, a collection of hand cultivators, packages of seeds that had long since expired. Sarah had believed in growing things, in nurturing life from soil and sunshine and careful attention. She always said a garden was an act of faith, he murmured to Scout, who had followed him into the shed and was investigating the dusty corners with typical thoroughness, believing that spring would come, that seeds would grow, that there would be someone there to harvest what you planted. The idea came to him slowly, like dawn breaking over the mountains. The puppies would need fresh food as they grew. He could certainly afford to buy vegetables in town, but there was something appealing about the idea of providing for them with his own hands, of nurturing life the way Sarah would have done. By the time Tommy arrived, walking up the mountain path with the determined stride of a boy on an adventure, Elias had cleared a small plot behind the cabin and was examining the soil with professional interest. The puppies had been helping by digging their own holes and depositing various treasures they'd found, sticks, interesting rocks, and what appeared to be the mummified remains of a chipmunk. "Mr. Boone," Tommy called out as he crested the final ridge. "This place is amazing." Elias looked around, trying to see his home through the boy's eyes. The cabin sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines, with the valley stretching out below like a green carpet. A creek ran nearby, its voice a constant murmur of contentment. It was beautiful, he supposed, though he'd stopped noticing. Beauty years ago. "It's quiet," Elias said, which seemed like an understatement even as he said it. "It's perfect," Tommy replied with the certainty that only 12-year-olds could manage. "And where are— Oh my gosh, look at them!" The puppies had spotted the newcomer and were approaching with varying degrees of enthusiasm and caution. Scout, predictably, was first to investigate, followed closely by Brave. Gentle hung back, watching carefully, while Swift darted in quick. Circles around the group. Strong approached with dignified deliberation, and Wise simply sat down and observed the proceedings with his characteristic gravity. "They're so much bigger than I expected," Tommy said, dropping to his knees as the puppies surrounded him. "And they're beautiful." Watching Tommy interact with the dogs, Elias was struck by how naturally the boy moved among them, how quickly he understood their individual personalities. When Scout nudged his hand for attention, Tommy gave it readily. When Gentle approached, more cautiously, he waited for her to come to him, rather than reaching out. It was exactly the kind of intuitive understanding Sarah had always shown with animals. "Your grandmother knew about dogs," Elias observed. "She had a collie when I was little. Taught me that dogs always tell you who they are if you know how to listen." Tommy was now sitting cross-legged in the dirt, while Brave attempted to climb into his lap. She said people could learn a lot from dogs, about being loyal and brave and true. The afternoon passed more quickly than Elias had expected. Tommy helped with feeding time, marveling at the puppies' enthusiastic approach to their meals. He assisted with basic training exercises, proving surprisingly good at giving clear commands and consistent praise. Most unexpectedly, he showed genuine interest in the garden project, asking thoughtful questions about soil preparation and seed selection. "My mom has a garden," Tommy explained as they worked together to remove rocks from the cleared plot. "She grows tomatoes and beans, and the best sweet corn you ever tasted. Says there's nothing like food you grew yourself. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She is. She's the one who told me about you and Mrs. Boone, about how much you loved each other and how sad you've been since she died." The casual mention of Sarah should have triggered Elias's usual retreat into silence, but somehow, coming from this earnest boy while surrounded by playful puppies, it felt more like acknowledgement than intrusion. "She was special," Elias said quietly. "Had a way of making everything better just by being there, like the puppies do for you now." The observation was so perceptive, so simply stated, that Elias had to pause in his work. "Yes," he said finally, "very much like that." As the sun began To sink toward the western peaks, Tommy reluctantly prepared to head back to town. The puppies seemed to sense his departure, clustering around him for final pets and promises that he'd return soon. "Could I maybe come back next week?" Tommy asked with the hopeful expression of someone trying not to seem too eager. "I could help with the garden, maybe teach them some new commands." Elias found himself nodding before he'd fully considered. The implications. That would be helpful. Gardens need regular attention, and dogs need socialization, Tommy added solemnly, clearly repeating something he'd heard from an adult. It's important for their development. After Tommy left, Elias sat on his porch with his evening coffee, watching the puppies explore their territory in the fading light. Scout had claimed the highest point on the woodpile as his lookout post. Gentle was carefully investigating the new garden plot, her nose twitching at the unfamiliar sense of disturbed earth. The others had settled into their usual evening routine of play and exploration. That night his journal entry was longer than usual. Day 32. Tommy Fletcher visited today. Good boy, respectful, gentle with the puppies, genuinely helpful. Reminded me of myself at that age, before life got complicated. Started work on Sarah's garden. Found her tools in the shed still in good condition. She always said a garden was an act of faith. Maybe it's time I started having a little faith. Again. The puppies seem to approve of the plan. They've claimed the garden as their new favorite digging spot. Tomorrow I'll need to build a fence around it or there won't be anything left to plant. He paused, pen hovering over the page, then added one final line. Sarah would have liked Tommy. She always said children see the world the way it should, be not the way it is. Maybe that's exactly what I need to remember how to do. 2 weeks later, Tommy arrived carrying something carefully wrapped in tissue paper, his face bright with the kind of excitement that suggested he was holding a treasure beyond measure. The puppies, now 10 weeks old and significantly more coordinated, greeted him with their usual enthusiasm, but it was clear the boy had something important on his mind. "I brought you something," he announced after the initial chaos of puppy greetings had settled. "Mom found it when she was cleaning out Grandma's attic." Elias accepted the package with curious caution. Inside the tissue paper was a photograph, faded at the edges but still clear enough to transport him back across the decades. It showed him and Sarah at the town's annual harvest dance, probably taken 22 years ago, back when his face was unlined and his hair was dark brown instead of grey. Sarah was wearing a blue dress that brought out her eyes, and they were both laughing at something outside the frame. Her hand was tucked into his arm, and they looked impossibly young and happy. "Mom said you and Mrs. Boone were the best dancers." "At every town event," Tommy said, watching Elias's face carefully. "Said you two could make even the worst fiddle music sound like a symphony." Elias stared at the photograph, memory flooding back in waves. He remembered that particular dance, remembered how Sarah had insisted they attend, even though he'd preferred staying home. She'd been right, of course. She usually was. They danced until his feet ached and her cheeks were flushed with laughter. It had been one of those perfect evenings that seemed to stretch on forever, full of music and community and the simple joy of being young and in love. "I forgot this existed," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Mom thought you might like to have it. She said sometimes having pictures helps us remember the good times instead of just the sad ones." Wise, who had developed an uncanny ability to sense emotional moments, padded over and sat beside Elias's chair. Without thinking, Elias reached down to stroke the puppy's soft fur, finding comfort in the warm, solid presence. "Your mother's a thoughtful woman," Elias said. "Thank you for bringing this." The photograph seemed to unlock something in him, and as they worked together in the garden that afternoon, planting tomatoes and beans and the sweet corn Tommy had promised would be the best he'd ever tasted, Elias found himself sharing stories about Sarah that he'd kept locked away for 20 years. "She had this way of talking to plants," he told Tommy, as they carefully transplanted seedlings. "Used to say they grew better if you told them about your day. I thought it was foolishness until I tried it myself. Her vegetables always came in, twice as big as anyone else's. "Did you really dance at all the town events?" Tommy asked, gently firming soil around a tomato plant. "Every single one. Sarah loved to dance, and I loved making her happy." Elias smiled at the memory. "Wasn't much good at it when we first met, but she was patient. Taught me that dancing wasn't about getting the steps right. It was about moving together, trusting each other to be there." Scout, who had been supervising their work from his perch on a nearby stump, suddenly stood at attention, his ears pricked forward. One by one, the other puppies stopped what they were doing and focused on something beyond Elias's hearing. Their body language suggested alertness rather than alarm, but it was clear something had captured their attention. "What is it, boy?" Elias asked, following Scout's gaze toward the tree line. That's when he heard it, the low rumble of an engine, making its way up the mountain road. Visitors were rare enough that the sound was noteworthy, but when Sheriff Morrison's patrol car came into view, Elias felt a familiar tightness in his chest. In his experience, law enforcement didn't make social calls. Kate Morrison climbed out of her car with the unhurried movements of someone who brought either very good news or very bad news. And from her expression, Elias suspected it wasn't the former. The puppies, however, had no such reservations. To them, any new person was a potential source of attention and possibly treats. "Afternoon, Elias." "Tommy." She nodded to both of them, then knelt to greet the approaching puppies. "These must be the famous 6 I've been hearing about. They're getting big," Tommy said proudly, as if he'd personally contributed to their growth. "They are indeed." Sheriff Morrison scratched behind Brave's ears, earning an enthusiastic tail wag. "Beautiful dogs. Smart, too, from what I hear." Elias waited. 20 years of mountain living had taught him patience, and he could sense there was more to this visit than admiring his puppies. "Actually, I came up here because I wanted to talk to you about something," Sheriff Morrison continued, straightening up. "We've been having some trouble down in the valley. Livestock attacks." "What kind of attacks?" Elias asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Started about 2 weeks ago. First it was chickens, whole coops torn apart but not for food. Then it escalated. Lost a calf last week, and yesterday morning the Hendersons found 2 of their goats torn up pretty bad." Elias frowned. The pattern Sheriff Morrison was describing didn't sound like typical predator behavior. Mountain lions and bears killed for food, efficiently and without waste. What she was describing sounded more systematic, more deliberate. "Sounds like pack behavior," he said. "That's what I was thinking." Doc Martinez took a look at the wounds on those goats. Said they were definitely canine. Too big for coyotes. Wrong pattern for domestic dogs. "Wolves," Sheriff Morrison nodded grimly. "That's our best guess. Problem is there hasn't been a confirmed wolf pack in this area for over 50 years. Fish and Wildlife is sending someone up to investigate, but in the meantime, folks are getting nervous." Elias could understand their concern. Wolves were magnificent animals, but they were also apex predators with the capability to cause serious damage if they felt threatened or desperate. A pack that had taken to killing livestock was a problem that wouldn't resolve itself. "Any idea where they might be denning?" he asked. "That's actually why I'm here. You know these mountains better than anyone. I was hoping you might be willing to help track them down." The request hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. For 20 years, Elias had used his wilderness skills for his own survival and nothing more. He'd deliberately isolated himself from the community's problems and needs. But looking at Sheriff Morrison's concerned face and thinking about the frightened livestock owners in the valley below, he found his old instincts stirring. "I'll take a look," he heard himself say. Tommy's eyes went wide with excitement. "Can the puppies help? They're really good at tracking stuff." "They're too young," Elias said automatically, then paused. The puppies were indeed showing remarkable aptitude for scent work and had been displaying increasingly sophisticated pack behaviors. But in a few weeks, maybe. if the situation hasn't been resolved by then. Sheriff Morrison looked relieved. I appreciate this, Elias. Really. I know you value your privacy, and I wouldn't ask if we weren't genuinely concerned about public safety. After she left, Elias found himself looking at his 6 dogs with new eyes. They were no longer just companions, helping him heal from old wounds. They were becoming something more, a pack with purpose, skills that might serve the community that had unknowingly supported his exile for 2 decades. That evening, as he wrote in his journal by firelight, Elias reflected on how much his world had expanded in just a few short weeks. Day 46. Sheriff Morrison asked for help tracking wolves that have been attacking livestock. Said yes without thinking. Strange how easy it was to agree to help when it might benefit the community. The puppies are growing into their roles. Scout already shows leadership qualities, and all of them have natural tracking instincts. Sarah always said we're all connected to each other, whether we admit it or not. Maybe it's time I started admitting it. He paused, looking at the photograph Tommy had brought, now propped against the lamp where he could see it as he wrote. Tommy brought a picture of Sarah and me at the harvest dance. Amazing how young we look, how happy. She would have loved these, and Puppies would have probably named them better than I did. But I think she'd approve of what's happening here. She always believed in helping others when you had the skills to do so. Tomorrow I'll start scouting for wolf sign. Time to see if 20 years in these mountains taught me anything useful. The old tracking equipment felt familiar in Elias's hands, like greeting old friends after a long absence. The leather satchel had been crafted by his grandfather, passed down through generations of men who understood that survival in the mountains required more than just courage. It demanded skill, patience, and the kind of deep knowledge that could only be earned through years of careful observation. Inside the worn leather were the tools of his former trade, a compass that had guided him through countless wilderness expeditions, binoculars that could pick out details at impossible distances, measuring tape for documenting track patterns, and a collection of small containers for taking plaster casts of prints. There was also his grandfather's tracking journal, filled with decades of observations about animal behavior and movement patterns. The puppies watched with intense interest as Elias checked each item, their instincts telling them that something important was happening. Scout in particular seemed to understand that this was work rather than play, settling into a position where he could observe without interfering. "We're going to start your real education today," Elias told them as he shouldered the pack. "Time to learn what these mountains can teach you." The first kill site was less than a mile from the Henderson Ranch, in a grove of aspens where the morning light filtered through leaves that rustled like whispered secrets. The scene told a story that made Elias's jaw tighten with concern. This wasn't random predation. It was the work of animals that knew exactly what they were doing. The goat had been brought down cleanly, efficiently, with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of pack intelligence. But what troubled Elias most was what hadn't happened. The carcass had been partially consumed, then abandoned. Wolves didn't waste meat unless something was very wrong. "Look at this," he murmured to the puppies, pointing to the ground around the kill site. "See how the tracks overlap? Multiple animals working together. But notice how they circle back, how they approach from different angles. This isn't just hunting. This is strategy." The puppies' noses twitched as they processed the complex scent. Signatures left behind. Brave was the first to pick up the trail, his small body going rigid with concentration as he followed the scent line toward the tree line. One by one, the others joined him, their natural tracking instincts beginning to emerge under the guidance of the information their senses were providing. Elias followed their lead, amazed at how quickly they were processing the scene. These weren't just pets. They were developing into working dogs with an intuitive understanding of the wilderness that surrounded them. Scout paused at a particular spot, whining softly, and when Elias investigated, he found clear evidence of where the pack had paused to rest after the kill. Good boy, Elias praised, and Scout's tail wagged with pride at having contributed something useful to the investigation. The trail led higher into the mountains, through terrain that grew increasingly rugged with each mile. Elias found himself grateful for his daily routine with the puppies. Their energy and enthusiasm had pushed him to maintain a level of physical fitness he might have otherwise neglected. The years of solitude hadn't been kind to his body, but 6 demanding young dogs had done more for his conditioning than any deliberate exercise program could have managed. By midday, they'd covered 5 miles of rough country and documented 3 more kill sites. Each one told the same story: coordinated attacks by multiple animals, partial consumption, and then abandonment. The pattern was troubling because it suggested the wolves weren't killing primarily for food. Something else was driving their behavior. As they crested a ridge that overlooked the valley, Elias paused to study the landscape below through his binoculars. The puppies arranged themselves around him, panting from the morning's exertion, but still alert and eager. From this vantage point, he could see the scattered ranches and farms that dotted the valley floor, each one a potential target for a pack that had learned to associate human settlements with easy prey. "There," he said quietly, focusing on a distant meadow where something had caught his attention. "See that?" The puppies followed his gaze, though they couldn't possibly see what he was looking at. But Wise, with his uncanny ability to read Elias's moods, pressed closer and made a soft, questioning sound. Through the binoculars, Elias could make out a group of large shapes moving across the far meadow. Even at this distance, their behavior was unmistakably canine, the loose, coordinated movement of a pack on the hunt. He counted at least 6 animals, possibly more, and from their size and gait, they were definitely wolves. But something about their movement pattern troubled him. They weren't displaying the confident, purposeful behavior of apex predators in their own territory. Instead, they seemed restless, almost agitated, constantly checking their surroundings as if expecting threats from multiple directions. "You're displaced, aren't you?" Elias murmured, understanding beginning to dawn. "This isn't your territory, you're refugees." The realization changed everything. These weren't wolves that had simply decided to start preying on livestock out of convenience. They were animals that had been forced from their traditional territory and were struggling to establish themselves in unfamiliar terrain. The wasteful killing pattern wasn't about food. It was about stress, confusion, and the desperate attempt to claim resources in an environment they didn't fully understand. The descent back to the valley took most of the afternoon, with frequent stops to rest the puppies and document additional sign along the way. By the time they reached Sheriff Morrison's office, Elias had developed a clear picture of what they were dealing with, and why the usual solutions might not be the right approach. "They're not rogue wolves," he explained to Sheriff Morrison, and Doc Martinez, who'd been called in to provide veterinary perspective on the attacks. "They're displaced. Something drove them from their traditional territory, and now they're trying to survive in country they don't know." "Does that make them less dangerous?" Sheriff Morrison asked. "Actually, it might make them more dangerous. In the short term," Elias admitted. "Stressed animals make poor decisions, but it also means there might be solutions that don't involve killing them." Doc Martinez leaned forward with interest. "What kind of solutions?" "Relocation. If we can figure out where they came from and why they left, we might be able to guide them to suitable territory where they won't conflict with human activities. And if that doesn't work," Elias was quiet for a moment, considering, "then we'll have to make harder choices. But I'd like to try the peaceful approach first." Sheriff Morrison nodded slowly. "How long do you think we have before the situation escalates?" "Not long. The pack is getting bolder, and if they start seeing humans as threats instead of just obstacles, we'll have a real crisis on our hands." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Tommy Fletcher's voice, raised in excitement, followed by the sound of multiple people talking at once. Through the window, Elias could see a small crowd gathering around a pickup truck that had just pulled up to the general store. "What's all that about?" Doc Martinez wondered aloud. Sheriff Morrison, was already moving toward the door. Only one way to find out. Outside, they found Tommy practically bouncing with agitation while his mother tried to calm him down. In the truck bed, wrapped in an old blanket, was a small form that made Elias's blood run cold. "Found him about a mile from our place," Tommy's father was explaining to the gathering crowd. "Poor little thing was half dead from exhaustion. Looks like he's been wandering for days." Elias approached the truck and carefully pulled back the blanket. Inside was a wolf pup, probably no more than 12 weeks old, dehydrated and clearly separated from his pack. The little animal's eyes were wide with terror, but he was too weak to do more than whimper softly. "This changes things," Elias said quietly to Sheriff Morrison. "How so?" Elias looked down at the frightened pup, then at his own 6 dogs, who had arranged themselves around the truck with expressions of intense curiosity. If there's a pup this young separated from the pack, it means they have a den somewhere close by. And if the parents can't find this little one, they're going to get increasingly desperate. The crowd was growing larger, and Elias could hear the murmur of voices discussing what should be done with the wolf pup. Some suggested taking it to the wildlife authorities, others worried about disease, and a few harsh voices suggested the problem would be solved if they simply let nature take its course. "I'll take him," Elias said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to him. "You sure about that?" Sheriff Morrison asked. "Wolf pups aren't domestic dogs. Even hand-raised, they can be unpredictable." Elias looked down at the terrified little creature, then at his own 6 puppies, who were watching the proceedings with intelligent eyes. "He's just a baby," he said simply, "and he might be the key to solving this whole situation peacefully." That evening, as he settled the wolf pup into a makeshift bed near the fireplace, Elias reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 2 months. He'd gone from a man who avoided all contact with living things to someone caring for 7 young animals and actively working to help his community solve a dangerous problem. In his journal that night, he wrote, "Day 52, found a wolf pup. Separated from his pack, the little one is terrified but unhurt. If I can gain his trust, he might help us understand what drove his family into our territory. The domestic pups are curious but not aggressive toward him. Maybe they recognize a kindred spirit." Sarah always said that sometimes the solution to a problem comes in the most unexpected packages. She was right about that too. The wolf pup's recovery over the next week revealed the depth of intelligence that ran in his bloodline. Despite his youth and trauma, he displayed an awareness and adaptability that impressed even Elias's experienced eye. The domestic puppies had accepted him immediately, and watching them interact provided crucial insights into wolf pack dynamics that no textbook could have taught. Elias had named him Shadow, partly for his dark grey coat and partly for the way he seemed to appear and disappear around the cabin with supernatural quiet. Unlike the boisterous energy of the domestic pups, Shadow moved with deliberate purpose, every action calculated and efficient. When he played, it was with the serious concentration of an animal learning survival skills. When he rested, he positioned himself where he could observe all approaches to his sleeping area. It was Shadow who led them to the discovery that changed everything. On the 7th day after his arrival, the pup began displaying restless behavior that Elias recognized as homesickness. He would position himself at the edge of the clearing, facing north toward the high country, and emit soft whines that seemed to carry for miles through the mountain air. The domestic puppies would gather around him during these episodes, offering comfort in the way that young animals instinctively understood. "You want to go home, don't you, boy?" Elias said, crouching beside the young wolf. "But where is home?" Shadow's response was to trot purposefully toward the tree line, pause, and look back expectantly. The message was clear. He wanted to show them something. Elias had planned to spend the morning working in the garden, but something about Shadow's urgency convinced him to follow the pup's lead. He gathered his tracking equipment and called the domestic puppies to heel. Whatever Shadow wanted to show them, it was important enough that the young wolf was willing to risk leaving the safety of the clearing. The journey that followed tested Elias's endurance and challenged everything he thought he knew about the local geography. Shadow led them along game trails that Elias had never noticed, through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate until you were actually doing it. The domestic puppies struggled to match the wolf pup's natural agility, but their determination to stay together as a pack drove them to overcome obstacles that should have been beyond their capabilities. After 3 hours of steady climbing, they emerged onto a plateau that Elias had never seen before, despite 20 years of exploring these mountains. The landscape opened into a hidden valley, sheltered by towering peaks and accessible only through the narrow passage they had just navigated. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a pristine wilderness that seemed untouched by human presence. But what stopped Elias in his tracks wasn't the scenic beauty. It was the evidence of systematic destruction that scarred the valley floor. Where there should have been pristine meadows and clear streams, the land showed signs of extensive mining activity. Heavy machinery had torn gouges in the earth, leaving behind raw wounds that would take decades to heal. Piles of excavated rock and tailings created artificial hills that disrupted the natural drainage patterns. Most devastating of all, a series of settling ponds contained water that gleamed with the unnatural colors of chemical contamination. "Dear God," Elias whispered, understanding flooding through him like cold water. This was why the wolves had been displaced. This hidden valley had been their territory, probably for generations, until mining operations had made it uninhabitable. The pack hadn't chosen to invade human settlements. They'd been driven from their home by human activity they couldn't understand or fight. Shadow whined softly and pressed against Elias's leg, his young mind processing the destruction of everything. "Familiar." The domestic puppies clustered around them, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, even if they couldn't comprehend its full significance. Elias spent the next hour documenting the site with his camera, taking photographs that would serve as evidence of the environmental damage. The mining operation appeared to have been abandoned recently, within the last few months, but not before inflicting irreversible harm on the ecosystem. Heavy metals and chemical runoff had poisoned the water sources that wildlife depended on. The noise and disruption of the extraction process would have made the area uninhabitable for any creature that required peace and security to raise their young. The wolf pack hadn't become aggressive predators by choice. They were refugees, displaced by forces beyond their control, struggling to survive in unfamiliar territory while dealing with the stress of losing everything they had known. The livestock attacks weren't malicious. They were desperate attempts to feed their families in an environment that offered few suitable prey options. "They're just like I was," Elias realized, the parallel hitting him with startling clarity. Driven from their home, angry at the world, lashing out because they don't know what else to do. The journey back to the cabin took place in contemplative silence. Shadow seemed relieved to have shared his burden, but the domestic puppies picked up on Elias's troubled mood and stayed close to his side. By the time they reached home, Elias had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. That evening, Sheriff Morrison arrived at the cabin in response to Elias's radio call. She found him sitting on the porch with all 7 animals arranged around him like a council of war, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "I know why the wolves are here," he said without preamble. "And I know why they're behaving the way they are." He told her about the hidden valley, about the mining operation, and the environmental destruction they'd discovered. He showed her the photographs he'd taken, pointing out details that spoke to the extent of the damage and the timeline of the wolves' displacement. "This changes everything," Sheriff Morrison said after reviewing the evidence. "If these animals were driven from their territory by illegal mining operations, then they're not the problem, they're victims. That's exactly what they are. But they're still dangerous to the community, and people are still frightened. We need to find a solution that protects everyone, human and wolf. What did you have in mind? Elias looked out at the mountains that had been his refuge for 2 decades, then down at Shadow, who was watching him with ancient eyes that seemed to understand more than any puppy should. Relocation. There are suitable territories further north, areas where they could establish a new pack without conflicting with human activities. But first, we need to reunite this little one with his family. He's the key to gaining their trust. That sounds incredibly dangerous. It is, but it's also the right thing to do. Elias reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. These wolves didn't choose this conflict any more than the ranchers did. They're all victims of decisions made by people who didn't consider the consequences of their actions. Sheriff Morrison was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. The mining company should be held responsible for this. Environmental crimes of this magnitude, there have to be federal regulations they've violated. Agreed. But that's a long-term solution. Right now, we have a pack of displaced wolves and a community of frightened people. We need to address the immediate crisis before we worry about justice for past actions. That night, Elias's journal entry was longer and more reflective than any he'd written since beginning his documentation of life with the puppies. Day 59. Discovered the truth about the wolf pack today. They're not predators. They're refugees, driven from their home by mining operations that destroyed their territory. Looking at that poisoned valley, I understood something about my own displacement that I'd never recognized before. Like the wolves, I was driven from my life by forces I couldn't control. Like them, I spent years lashing out at a world that had taken everything I cared about. But unlike them, I had the luxury of choice. I could have stayed in town, could have accepted help and comfort from people who cared about me. The wolves have no such options. They adapt or they die, and adaptation sometimes requires behaviors that put them in conflict with others. Tomorrow I begin the most dangerous thing I've attempted since Sarah died, trying to reunite Shadow with his pack and convince wild animals to trust a human enough to accept relocation. If I fail, people could die. If I succeed, maybe 2 communities, human and wolf, can find a way to coexist. Sarah always said that the measure of a person wasn't how they handled success, but how they responded when life demanded more than they thought they could give. I'm about to find out what kind of man 20 years of grief and healing have made me. He paused, looking at the photograph Tommy had brought him, now prominently displayed on the mantel above the fireplace. I wish you were here to advise me, Sarah, but I think I know what you'd say. You'd tell me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being afraid. Tomorrow, I'm going to try to be the man you always believed I could be. The morning of the planned reunion dawned gray and heavy with the promise of storm clouds gathering over the peaks. Elias had spent the night going over his plan repeatedly, checking and rechecking every detail, knowing that a single mistake could cost lives, both human and animal. Shadow seemed to sense the importance of the day, staying close to Elias's side, while the domestic puppies maintained their usual morning routine with subdued energy. Sheriff Morrison arrived at first light, accompanied by Doc Martinez and, to Elias's surprise, Tommy Fletcher. The boy's presence sparked immediate concern. Tommy shouldn't be here, Elias said firmly. This is too dangerous. I tried to tell him that, Sheriff Morrison replied, but he made some compelling arguments about why he should come along. Tommy stepped forward with the earnest determination that only 12-year-olds could muster. The puppies trust me, and Shadow trusts the puppies. If something goes wrong, they might listen to me when they won't listen to anyone else. It was sound reasoning, but Elias still felt the weight of responsibility for the boy's safety. Your parents agreed to this? Mom wasn't happy about it, but Dad said sometimes you have to trust people to do what they think is right, even when you're scared for them. Doc Martinez hefted a medical bag that looked like it could handle anything from a scraped knee to emergency surgery. I've got supplies for both human and animal injuries, and tranquilizer darts if we need to sedate anyone, wolf or otherwise. Elias reached into his jacket and withdrew Sarah's compass, its brass surface polished to a warm glow despite its age. He'd found it the night before while packing his gear, tucked away in the drawer where she'd always kept it. The needle still pointed true north, just as it had when she'd used it during their hiking expeditions in the early years of their marriage. She carried this on every adventure we took together, he told the assembled group. Said it would always. Bring her home safe. Today I'm hoping it'll guide us all to where we need to be. The plan was straightforward in concept, terrifyingly complex in execution. Using Shadow as an intermediary, they would locate the wolf pack and attempt to establish peaceful contact. If successful, Elias would try to communicate the relocation option using a combination of body language, scent markers, and the universal language of offering food. The domestic puppies would serve as proof of his peaceful intentions, while the human team would maintain a safe distance unless direct intervention became necessary. As they loaded the vehicles for the journey to the rendezvous point, Elias felt the familiar pre-mission tension he remembered from his younger days when he'd guided hunting parties through dangerous terrain. But this was different. Instead of pursuing prey, they were trying to prevent a tragedy that could destroy two communities. The first part of the journey took them along established roads through countryside that looked deceptively peaceful in the grey morning light. But as they reached the staging area where they would transfer to foot travel, the signs of the ongoing crisis became impossible to ignore. Several ranches they passed had livestock in pastures closer to the houses than was typical, with hastily erected additional fencing and lights that suggested sleepless nights spent watching for predators. At the Henderson Ranch, they stopped to coordinate final details with the local search and rescue team that Sheriff Morrison had quietly assembled. These were experienced outdoorsmen who understood both the dangers of the situation and the importance of the peaceful resolution Elias was attempting. "Remember," Sheriff Morrison addressed the team, "we're here as backup only. Mr. Boone leads this operation, and we follow his instructions unless someone's life is in immediate danger." Jim Henderson, whose goats had been among the wolves' victims, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "I want this to work as much as anyone, but if those wolves threaten my family or my neighbors, I won't hesitate to defend them." "No one's asking you to," Elias replied, "but give the peaceful approach a chance before we resort to violence. These animals didn't choose this conflict." The hike to the contact zone took 3 hours through increasingly difficult terrain. Shadow led the way with unerring instinct, while the domestic puppies, now strong adolescents, handled the rough country with surprising grace. Tommy proved to be an able hiker, keeping up with the adults without complaint, despite the demanding pace. As they climbed higher, the weather began to deteriorate. The storm clouds that had been gathering all morning finally began to deliver on their threat, starting with a few scattered drops that quickly intensified into steady rainfall. The wet conditions would make tracking more difficult, but they would also mask human scent and sound, potentially making their approach less threatening to the wolves. 2 miles from their destination, Shadow suddenly stopped and raised his head, ears pricked forward. A sound carried faintly through the rain, a long, mournful howl that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. It was answered almost immediately by another voice, then another, until the mountains rang with the wild music of a pack calling. "To its lost member. They know he's here," Elias said quietly. "Shadow, can you answer them? Let them know you're safe." The young wolf looked up at him, with eyes that seemed far too wise for his age, then lifted his muzzle and released a high, clear call that carried perfectly through the damp air. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A chorus of adult voices expressing relief, joy, and urgent invitation for him to return to his family. "They're close," Doc Martinez observed. "Maybe half a mile." Elias nodded, feeling his heart rate increase as the magnitude of what they were attempting became fully real. In the next hour, he would either achieve something unprecedented, peaceful, contact between humans and a wild wolf pack, or he would trigger a confrontation that could end in tragedy for everyone involved. "This is where we separate," he told the team. "I go forward with Shadow and the puppies. Everyone else maintains position here unless you hear the emergency signal." Tommy started to protest, but Elias cut him off gently. "I need you to stay with the adults, son. If something goes wrong, the puppies will need someone they trust to call them back to safety." The boy nodded reluctantly, understanding the logic even if he didn't like being left behind. Elias checked his gear one final time: emergency radio, first aid supplies, the bag of food offerings he'd prepared, and Sarah's compass to guide him. Home. The domestic puppies arranged themselves around him and Shadow, their instincts telling them that this was the most important work they'd ever be asked to do. "Scout, brave, gentle, swift, strong, wise," he said, calling each of them by name. "You're not just pets anymore. Today, you're diplomats. Help me show them that humans and wolves can coexist." The rain was falling steadily now, turning the forest floor into a carpet of mud and wet leaves that muffled their footsteps. As they moved forward through the trees, Elias found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 2 months ago, he'd been a broken hermit who avoided all contact with living things. Now he was leading a rescue mission that could determine the fate of an entire wolf pack and the safety of his human community. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to heal his own isolation by caring for abandoned puppies, he'd somehow become the bridge between two worlds that desperately needed to understand each other. Another howl echoed through the forest, closer this time, filled with the unmistakable urgency of parents calling for their lost child. Shadow responded immediately, his call carrying notes of reassurance and approaching reunion. "We're almost there," Elias murmured to his pack of domestic dogs. "Whatever happens next, remember that we're here to help, not to harm. Show them what it means to be a family." Through the trees ahead, he could see movement, large shapes that melted between the shadows like grey ghosts. The adult wolves had come to meet them, and there would be no turning back now. Elias took a deep breath, steadied himself with a glance at Sarah's compass, and stepped forward into the unknown, carrying with him the hopes of 2 communities and the future of 7 young animals who trusted him to keep them safe. The first glimpse of the adult wolves through the rain-soaked trees confirmed Elias's worst fears about their condition. These weren't the confident, well-fed predators that healthy packs should be. The animals that materialized from the forest shadows were lean to the point of gauntness, their coats dull and patchy from stress and malnutrition. Most telling of all, their body language spoke of desperation rather than natural wariness, the tense, hyper-vigilant posture of creatures who had been pushed beyond their limits. Shadow bounded forward with the joyful abandon of a child running to his parents, but stopped short when the pack's alpha, a massive grey male with scars across his muzzle, issued a sharp warning bark. The message was clear: approach slowly, with caution, because danger might follow even a beloved pack member home. Elias halted immediately, signaling his own dogs to do the same. The domestic puppies, sensing the gravity of the moment, arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around him, their posture alert but non-threatening. Scout, showing the leadership qualities that had emerged over the past months, positioned himself slightly ahead of the others, ready to serve as spokesman for their small pack. Through the steady drumbeat of rain, Elias could hear the soft whines and murmurs of wolves greeting their lost family member. Shadow was being inspected, sniffed, and gently nuzzled by what appeared to be his mother, a smaller grey female whose ribs showed clearly through her thin coat. The reunion was tender but brief. Within moments, the adult wolves' attention returned to the humans who had brought their pup home. The alpha male stepped forward, his yellow eyes fixed on Elias with an intensity that seemed to penetrate straight through to his soul. This was the moment of truth, the instant when two apex species would determine whether they could coexist or whether violence was inevitable. Elias slowly reached into his pack and withdrew a large piece of venison he'd prepared specifically for this encounter. Moving with deliberate care, he placed the meat on the ground halfway between himself and the wolf pack, then retreated several steps to show he meant no threat. The alpha's nostrils flared as he caught the scent of the offering, but he made no move toward it. Instead, his gaze shifted to the domestic puppies, and Elias could practically see the calculations taking place behind those intelligent eyes. These young dogs carried human scent, but displayed pack behaviors. They were submissive to the human, but protective of each other. What did this unusual arrangement mean? Scout, with the intuitive wisdom that had characterized him from the beginning, took a step forward and lowered himself into a play bow, the universal canine signal for peaceful intentions. One by one, his littermates followed suit, until all 6 domestic puppies were offering the traditional greeting of young animals seeking acceptance from elders. The response from the wolf pack was immediate and remarkable. Several of the adults relaxed their aggressive postures, and what appeared to be Shadow's father, a lean black male with intelligent eyes, actually stepped forward to investigate these strange hybrid creatures that smelled of humans but behaved like proper pack members. But it was Shadow himself who provided the breakthrough moment. The young wolf moved confidently to his father's side, then looked back at Elias and the domestic puppies, and issued a series of soft barks and whines. To Elias's amazement, it sounded exactly like an introduction, as if Shadow was formally presenting his new friends to his family. The black male approached Scout cautiously, the two animals engaging in the careful ritual of mutual sniffing and assessment that would determine whether they could trust each other. Scout remained perfectly still, allowing the adult wolf to gather all the information he needed, while his littermates watched with fascination. After what felt like an eternity, the black male stepped back and issued a soft chuff, the wolf equivalent of approval. Permission granted for closer contact. What followed was unlike anything Elias had ever witnessed. The domestic puppies and the wolf pack began a slow, careful dance of interaction, with Shadow serving as translator and intermediary. Brave was the first to approach the alpha female, offering her the same respectful submission he showed to Elias. Gentle, true to her nature, won over several of the younger pack members with her calm, non-threatening demeanor, but it was Wise who achieved the most remarkable connection. The puppy approached the pack's alpha male with a confidence that should have been impossible for such a young animal, and after a tense moment of mutual assessment, the great wolf actually lowered his head to allow Wise to touch noses with him, the ultimate gesture of acceptance and respect. Through all of this, Elias remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe as he watched two species find common ground through the universal language of family bonds and mutual respect. The rain continued to fall around them, but within their small circle, something extraordinary was happening, a bridge being built between worlds that had been separated by fear and misunderstanding. The alpha male finally turned his attention back to Elias, but now his expression had changed. The desperate wariness was still there, but it was tempered by something that might have been curiosity, even hope. Shadow trotted to his father's side and looked back at Elias expectantly, his message clear. It was time for the human to prove he could be trusted with his family's survival. Elias took a deep breath and stepped forward into the most dangerous moment of his life. The breakthrough came when Elias noticed the alpha female favoring her left front paw, a subtle limp that spoke of injury or infection. Moving with the slow deliberation of someone who understood that a single wrong gesture could shatter the fragile trust they'd built, Elias opened his veterinary supply kit and withdrew a tube of antibiotic ointment and clean bandaging material. The Alpha male's hackles rose immediately at the sight of unfamiliar objects, but Shadow intervened with a series of soft barks that seemed to carry reassurance. The young wolf approached Elias, allowed him to examine his own paws as a demonstration, then trotted back to his pack with his tail wagging in a clear signal of approval. The injured female watched this exchange with intelligent eyes, and when Elias slowly extended his hand toward her, she didn't retreat. Instead, she allowed him to gently lift her paw and examine the infected pad that had been causing her pain. The wound wasn't serious, probably caused by stepping on something sharp during their displacement, but left untreated, it could become life-threatening. Working with the careful precision of someone who understood that one false move could end in tragedy, Elias cleaned the wound and applied medication while the entire pack watched in tense silence. The female never flinched, as if she understood that this strange human was trying to help rather than harm. When he finished and stepped back, something remarkable happened. The alpha female approached him and briefly touched her nose to his, and the same gesture of acceptance she'd offered to Wise earlier. In that moment, Elias felt a connection that transcended species, a recognition of shared purpose and mutual respect. But their peaceful interaction was shattered by a sound that chilled Elias to the bone, a human voice calling out in distress, echoing through the rain-soaked forest from somewhere behind them. "Help! Somebody help me!" It was Tommy Fletcher's voice, high with fear and pain, coming from the direction where they'd left the support team. Something had gone terribly wrong. Wolfpack reacted instantly to the sound of human distress, their recently relaxed postures snapping back to full alert. But instead of fleeing or preparing to attack, they seemed to be waiting for direction from their human visitor, a level of trust that Elias found both humbling and terrifying. "Scout, Swift, go find Tommy," Elias commanded, falling back on the training that had become second nature to his dogs. "The rest of you, stay with me." The two puppies bounded off through the trees while Elias faced the most difficult decision of his life. He could abandon this breakthrough with the wolves to help Tommy, or he could trust that his dogs would handle the situation while he continued the delicate work of building interspecies understanding. Either choice carried the risk of disaster. The alpha male seemed to understand his dilemma. The great wolf looked in the direction of Tommy's cries, then back at Elias, and made a decision that would have seemed impossible if Elias hadn't witnessed it himself. The wolf issued a series of short barks to his pack, and three of the younger adults immediately loped off in pursuit of Scout and Swift. "You're going to help him," Elias breathed in amazement. "You're going to help a human child." Within minutes, Scout's distinctive bark echoed through the forest, the sharp, urgent call he used to signal, "Found, but needs help." The sound was answered immediately by the deeper howls of the adult wolves, creating a communication network that spanned the forest. When the rescue party returned 20 minutes later, they brought with them a sight that would be burned into Elias's memory forever. Tommy Fletcher was walking slowly but steadily, supported by Scout on one side and a grey wolf on the other. The boy had apparently fallen into a hidden ravine, spraining his ankle and scraping his face, but the makeshift shelter he'd constructed from fallen branches while waiting for help showed the same courage and resourcefulness that had convinced Elias to let him come on this dangerous mission. "They found me before Scout did," Tommy explained, in a voice filled with wonder as Doc Martinez examined his injuries. "I was scared at first, but then I remembered what you said about them being refugees, just like you were. So I talked to them the same way I talked to the puppies, and they stayed with me until help came." The wolf who had helped rescue Tommy, Shadow's mother, Elias realized, approached the injured boy with the same gentle concern she might show for one of her own pups. She sniffed carefully at his bandaged ankle, then looked up at Elias with an expression that seemed to ask if the small human would be all right. "He'll be fine," Elias said softly, addressing the wolf as if she could understand every word. "Thank you for protecting him." What happened next defied every assumption Elias had ever held about wild animals and their relationship with humans. The alpha male approached the gathered group, human and canine together, and carefully picked up the piece of venison Elias had offered earlier. Instead of eating it, he carried it to Tommy and gently placed it at the boy's feet. It was a gift, a formal offering of friendship from one pack to another, acknowledging that they were no longer enemies but allies in the complex business of survival. As the rain finally began to ease and shafts of sunlight broke through the clouds, Elias looked around at the extraordinary scene they'd created. Wolves and domestic dogs mingled freely. Tommy sat chatting with Shadow, as if interspecies friendship was the most natural thing in the world. And for the first time in months, the adult wolves looked hopeful rather than desperate. "Now comes the hard part," Elias murmured to himself, watching the pack interact with their new human friends. "Convincing them to trust us enough to accept relocation to a place where they can build a new life." But as he watched Shadow's father nuzzle Scout's ears in a gesture of paternal approval, Elias felt a growing confidence that even the impossible might be achievable when built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. 3 months later, Elias stood on his front porch watching the morning sun paint the valley in shades of gold and amber, much as he had done thousands of times before. But everything else had changed in ways he could never have imagined when he first brought 6 frightened puppies home to his lonely cabin. The wooden sign he'd carved and mounted beside his front door caught the early light, its hand-lettered message visible to anyone who made the journey up the mountain path: "Boone Family Farm, all are welcome." The words represented more than just an invitation. They were a declaration of transformation, a public acknowledgement that the hermit of Dry Hollow had become something entirely different. Inside the expanded cabin, the sounds of life filled spaces that had been silent for 20 years. Scout padded through the main room with the confident stride of a dog who understood his responsibilities as pack leader, while his 5 littermates pursued their own morning routines. Shadow, now fully grown and magnificent in his wild beauty, maintained his role as bridge between the domestic and wild worlds, equally comfortable with human companionship and wolf protocol. The relocation of the wolf pack had taken 6 weeks of careful planning and patient trust-building, but it had ultimately succeeded beyond anyone's most optimistic expectations. Using a combination of traditional wildlife management techniques and the unprecedented cooperation of the wolves themselves, they had guided the pack to a pristine territory 200 miles north, where mining operations were prohibited and prey animals were abundant. The farewell between Shadow and his birth family had been difficult to witness, but the young wolf had made his choice with the same wisdom he'd shown throughout the crisis. He belonged with Elias and the domestic pack now, serving as living proof that cooperation between species was not only possible, but beneficial for everyone involved. Tommy Fletcher had become a regular fixture at the farm, visiting 3 times a week to help with training, garden maintenance, and what he proudly called diplomatic relations with the local wildlife. His ankle had healed perfectly, but the experience of being rescued by wolves had left him with a perspective on nature that impressed even seasoned outdoorsmen like his father. "Mr. Boone," Tommy called out as he crested the ridge, carrying a basket that undoubtedly contained fresh rolls from his mother's bakery. "Wait until you see what I brought." The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and Elias found himself smiling before he even knew what had prompted such excitement. At 68 years old, he was discovering that happiness could be contagious when you opened yourself to receiving it. "Let me guess," Elias said, accepting the warm basket. "Your mother's been experimenting with new recipes again." "Better than that. Look." Tommy pulled a folded newspaper from his jacket and spread it on the porch table. The headline made Elias's breath catch in his throat. "Local mountain man brokers. Historic peace between wolves and ranchers." The article, complete with photographs from the rescue mission, told the story of their unprecedented achievement in terms that made Elias sound like some kind of folk hero. More importantly, it detailed the federal investigation that had resulted from their discovery of the illegal mining operation, leading to substantial fines for the responsible company and funding for habitat restoration in the damaged valley. "You're Amos?" Tommy said with obvious pride. "Mom says people from the university want to come study what you did, and the Wildlife Service wants to hire you as a consultant." Elias shook his head in amazement. "Never figured on being famous. Just wanted to help some displaced animals find a new home." "Same thing Dad said about you," Tommy replied. "That the best heroes are the ones who don't think they're being heroic." The morning routine proceeded as it had for weeks now, feeding the expanded pack, tending the garden that now provided fresh vegetables for both human and canine consumption, and handling the steady stream of visitors who made the pilgrimage up the mountain to meet the man who had achieved the impossible. Sheriff Morrison arrived around midday, as she did twice a week now, ostensibly to check on the situation, but really to enjoy coffee and conversation with someone who had become a valued friend and advisor. Doc Martinez often joined these informal gatherings, along with various townspeople who had discovered that the former hermit of Dry Hollow was actually excellent company. "Any word from the university team?" Sheriff Morrison asked, settling into one of the additional chairs Elias had built for his frequent guests. "They'll be here next week to start their study. Apparently what we accomplished here is unprecedented in the literature on human-wildlife conflict resolution." Elias poured coffee for his visitor, still amazed that he was hosting regular social gatherings. "They want to document the techniques we used so they can be applied in other situations. You realize you've probably changed the way wildlife management is practiced across the country?" Elias looked out at his pack of 7 dogs, who had arranged themselves in the shade of the porch to supervise the human conversation. "I just followed what the dogs taught me, that most problems can be solved if you approach them with patience, respect, and the willingness to see things from the other fellow's perspective." That evening, as he had every night for the past several months, Elias made his final entry in the journal that had become his record of an extraordinary transformation. Day 152. Tommy brought news that the story has reached the national press. Hard to believe that 6 abandoned puppies and 1 lost wolf pup could lead to all this attention. But I suppose that's how most important changes happen, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of kindness that create ripples we never expected. The pack is thriving. Shadow has fully integrated with the domestic dogs, and all 7 of them serve as ambassadors when visitors come to learn about our methods. The garden Sarah always dreamed of is producing more vegetables than we can eat, so we share them with everyone who visits. Tomorrow marks exactly 5 months since I took those 6 puppies home from town. In that time, I've gone from a man who avoided all contact with living things to someone whose home is rarely empty of visitors, both human and animal. Sarah would have loved seeing the cabin full of life and laughter again. I still wear her ring on the chain around my neck, but now it feels less like a burden and more like a blessing. She was right about so many things, that we're all connected, that healing comes through helping others, and that love multiplied is never diminished. The mountain is still beautiful, the cabin is still my sanctuary, but now it's also something more. It's proof that even the most broken hearts can learn to love again, and that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose, rather than the ones you're born into. 6 puppies taught me how to be human again. 1 wolf pup showed me how to be a bridge between worlds, and a community I'd forgotten how to belong to welcomed me home with open arms. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new visitors, new opportunities to help animals and humans find ways to coexist. But tonight, sitting here with my family of 7 remarkable dogs and the memory of a woman who always believed in the possibility of healing, I am exactly where I belong." He closed the journal and looked up at the photograph on the mantel, himself and Sarah, young and happy and dancing. For the first time in 20 years, the memory brought him joy instead of pain. Outside, an owl called to its mate across the darkening valley, and from somewhere in the distance, a wolf answered with a song that spoke of contentment and home. Elias smiled, scratched shadow behind the ears, and prepared for sleep, surrounded by the gentle breathing of the family that had saved his life by allowing him to save theirs.